Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Version 1, a podcast where interesting people come to talk about their creative processes, imposter syndrome, inspiration, failures along the way, and much more. I'm your host, Waverly, and you can follow the show on Instagram at Version 1 Podcast and subscribe to our Substack, version1podcast.substack.com, and you can also find me on buymeacoffee.com/Waverly Colville. You can listen to this episode wherever you get your podcast or head over to YouTube to watch the video version. All right, everybody, I am here with my guest this week, the poet James Morehead. James, welcome to the show.
Welcome to you, Waverly. I'm so excited to be here and to talk to you about poetry, which is such an art form that's having a renaissance right now, online and in paper and everywhere.
Ooh, I didn't know that. I'm so excited to hear about that. Could we just start with having you introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure, my name is James Morehead. I'm the Poet Laureate Emeritus of Dublin, California. We'll talk about that in a bit. And in addition to writing poetry, which I've been doing for a long, long time since I was in 10th grade, I've also more recently hosted a poetry open mic. I've done multiple poetry events, poetry and chocolate, poetry and wine, poetry and
Ooh.
pizza. I've also produced three poetry films created from poems that I've written working with different filmmaker collaborators. So just poetry is just woven into every aspect of my non-day job life. And my day job is in tech, which is a totally different topic. But today we're going to focus on my poetry side.
Absolutely. When you were a child, what did you want to be when you grow up?
I think like a lot of kids, I wanted to be a veterinarian, and I read every book about being a veterinarian. And then, like a lot of kids, I figured out sort of the things inherent in being a vet, and then it became less interesting. But that's definitely one of the things where I started. But very early on, I loved writing, and I remember my parents getting me my first electronic typewriter at some age, and I would just write. Not poetry initially, just creative writing. I would just love writing stories and the process of writing, and I read a ton. I was really a voracious reader of physical books, and I still love reading physical books, although audiobooks are amazing too. So, yeah, then I discovered poetry in the 10th grade, and that pivoted where I've been focusing my writing ever since.
How did you discover poetry?
It was a 10th grade creative writing course and a wonderful teacher, and it was the first year at the school I was at where they had a creative writing course. And in that, we went through all sorts of different forms of creative writing, and the poetry section really unlocked my interest in poetry because it wasn't focused just on poets that were long, long dead a couple hundred years ago. And there are lots of wonderful classical poets of 100 years ago. We included a little bit of that, but he also included a lot of more contemporary poets and things that it would have more relevance to a high school student, and in forms that were all over the map, because poetry is such a flexible art form. So that really made me see poetry in a different way. Because I think poetry in high school can, if taught poorly, can make people think they're dumb, they don't understand it, it feels not relevant to them, when poetry is an art form that taps into just every human emotion, and there's so many contemporary poets that I think students will resonate with, and it's an art form that you can read in 90 seconds in many cases and be affected by it. So yeah, I think poetry taught well is accessible to anybody.
Yeah, absolutely. What were some of those poets that initially inspired you?
So definitely E. Cummings, William Carlos Williams, those were Sylvia Plath. These were all poets that really resonated with me, and just because they were more contemporary, especially E. Cummings of all the poets that I read early on, because he didn't follow any conventions, or he created conventions that he followed. So it just showed that poetry could be anything you wanted it to be.
Yeah, I love that. Absolutely. I think that sometimes, especially when you're taught poems in school, it's taught sometimes as it has to be like super overly complicated or super flowery, or it has to be like Shakespearean, But poetry, as you said, comes in so many different forms. Poems can be short and easy to understand. Poems can be really flowery. Like it's such a range. And that's where I think a lot of kids are like, oh, poetry is like boring because it's made to be so overly complicated, and it's made to sometimes, or it's taught in a way exactly how you said, where like sometimes people feel dumb if they don't understand it. But there's so many like beautiful, cool, and also like accessible poems for whatever your interest or taste might be. So I absolutely love that.
Yeah, I think everybody loves poetry. They just may not have found the poetry that they love, is the way I think about it. I think it's such a diverse art form that there's a poem for every person in the world.
I absolutely love that. What initially, once you started reading poetry and really enjoying it, what kind of gave you the push to pursue it?
So I always loved it, but for many years, I would write poetry when I had inspiration and wait for the perfect inspiration to start writing. And that meant I wrote a lot of poems I'm proud of, but it was sporadic. And it was in 2020 pandemic time, where a lot of people did, leaned into things that they didn't have time for with their day jobs and traveling and commuting. Or a friend of mine who ended up doing the cover art. There we go, the cover art for my first book. So a friend of mine said, "Hey, your poetry's really good. You should get it out there." And up to that point, I had shared with friends and family, and I hadn't really thought about publishing my poetry. And I also had a significant imposter syndrome hurdle to get over, that because my day job's in tech, I was thinking, well, I'm not really an artist, and I'm not really a poet, and that was a block I had to get through. But that little nudge from a friend made me think, okay, maybe I should. And then because of the pandemic and the stress over the economy and everything, I was not sleeping too well. So if I woke up in the middle of the night, I would just start writing on my phone in dark mode so I wouldn't drive my wife nuts. And I wrote for hours at night, and that would get me back to sleep. As a result, I started writing every day, which was totally different from from what I was doing up to that point. And I found that if you wait for inspiration, you'll get sporadic good ideas. But if you just write, the good ideas will flow out of that writing process. And a lot of it you'll throw away, but you'll get to a lot more ideas when you're writing all the time. And that was a real breakthrough.
Wow, I love that advice. That's fantastic advice. When you were writing these poems every single day, um, I know you mentioned like, oh, if you woke up in the middle of the night, you would write a poem or something like that. But did you also have sort of like a writing schedule or any routines around writing in addition to writing at night?
Unfortunately, no, other than once, there was one Christmas where I decided for 2 weeks around that time, I think it was the Christmas of 2020, I decided I'm going to write every single day and I won't eat breakfast until I have written something. And so I would go to sleep with no idea what I was going to write about, knowing that that next morning, if I wanted to eat breakfast and get out of bed, I had to write something. And that worked incredibly well. So I did do that for like 2.5 weeks over Christmas break. With my day job, it's super hard because of the commute and variability to get into a regular rhythm. That'll happen later in my life. But I did see that if you write every day, as professional writers do, then you will create a lot more great stuff. I remember the screenwriter of the Pixar movie Soul. I can't remember his name, but he had this great quote, which was something like, "A professional writer is someone who writes when they don't feel like it." That was the gist of it, And I think that from what reading about professional writers, like that, you just have to write even when you don't feel like it and push through that, kind of like a hiker. And I do a lot of hiking. The first 30 minutes of a hike, your body's getting warmed up. It's in some ways the hardest portion of the hike is the first 30 minutes. And then you get warmed up and then you get into a groove. The same thing with writing is it takes 15 to 30 minutes for your brain to get into a groove, to push out all the distractions. And you just have to push. That's the part I think people struggle with pushing through. I do as well. It's like once I get through that, then the writing process becomes really fun and different.
Yeah, it kind of sounds like, have you ever read The Artist's Way and done like morning pages? That kind of sounds very similar.
I have not, but I'm going to have to.
Okay, it's this book by Julie Cameron, or maybe it's Julia. I forgot her name exactly, but have you heard of The Artist's Way, the book?
I've had it recommended to me before, but I hadn't had a chance to read it.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
kind of like this like 14-week like creative course in a book, and you read like a chapter every week, but like one of the main principles is doing something called morning pages, where like first thing in the morning you brain dump into a journal and you have to write like 3 pages. And the point is to kind of get those juices flowing before you do anything else in your day. And so it sounds like you kind of were doing it inadvertently without even realizing
Yes.
it.
Because I knew if I left it till later in the day, life would take over and other. But if I knew that and I knew that I have to get out of bed and eat breakfast, or the my family's going to get really annoyed with me. It was so I would actually get up relatively early and just take up my phone and just start writing. I used to write everything longhand for the longest time. It was 2020 and this need to write in the middle of the night without turning on any lights that got me pivoted over from writing by hand to writing on my phone, which actually writing on my phone in Google Docs has had the benefit of I have a complete revision history of everything I've written since 2020. And I can go back to every poem and see the very first idea and then all the revisions along the way, which is pretty cool.
Oh, that is really cool. Yeah, because you can go into the history of the doc. Oh, how has like looking back through the edit history of your poems, like have you seen how you've grown or changed as a poet?
It certainly reminds me of poems where I had to really wrestle and struggle it to the ground. A good example of that was a poem that ended up being turned into a piece for baritone and piano, uh, which was just beautiful. A composer took the poem and turned it into a piece of music. And looking through that poem, it took me months to write. And I had the initial idea in the middle of the night, and I jotted it down, and I get to see that initial raw idea at 3 in the morning. But then making it work as a poem, I had to do pot stops for a month, come back to it, restructure it completely, and it was
Sorry,
a
my dog
major.
just jumped off the couch and knocked something over. Sorry about that.
That's that's all right. So I was it's really I've actually used it when I talked occasionally I talk to high school English classes, and I've shown them this edit process, and I created a series of screenshots of the edits. I think I actually have an article on my website too where it shows a subset of the edits, screenshots from Google Docs about how dramatically it changed, but still had the essence of it was there from the beginning.
Oh, that's so cool. What are some of your favorite themes to write about?
So it's gone through different things. So certainly my first two books, I should definitely hold them up. Porch to Red and Gray is a second book, and Canvas. Those are much more memoir poems or poems anchored on my life. There's some fantastical elements, although usually it weaves back to some experience I've had. And that's another thing I've learned is that you don't have to worry about your life being uninteresting to other people because it's rare. We're unicorns as entire people from birth to our current state. Our unique experiences lined up are unique, but individual experiences are unlikely to be purely unique. So I wrote a poem in my first book that I read at readings quite a bit called Crush, which is about having this crush on a teenage girl at a camp I was at, and that's something everybody can relate to. So I think even poetry also can spotlight a something small and make it something more universal and profound. And you don't have to worry about your life as a source of material being too little for poetry. But more recently, certainly in my third book. Oh yeah, again, I should do this. There you go. My third book. This leaned into kind of a creepier vibe, inspired by art, which is a form of poetry called ekphrastic poetry, inspired by art, with elements of me woven in there, but much more fantastical and imagined. And then the book I'm working on now, which will come out maybe next year, we'll see, is going to be a collection of poems inspired by museums in the San Francisco Bay Area, the museums, the artwork, and it's going to be kind of a guidebook to these museums, but told through poetry.
That's so cool. Yeah, as I was reading some of your poetry this morning, it's exactly what you said. I love that you can take obviously your own individual life experience, but most of our life experiences have some sort of universal like theme, or everyone can relate to having a crush. Or I read your poem about the New Yorker, where as I read
Mm.
it, I was like, I used to work for the New Yorker magazine,
Oh,
and
very
so I clicked
cool.
on that one,
Yeah.
and I was like, oh, cool. And I love and please tell me if if you had like a different meaning behind this, but I loved how and for those who haven't read it, the scene at least I pictured in my head as I read it was you talk about you're at somebody's, it sounds like, apartment, and you see they subscribe to the New Yorker as you do, and you're like, okay, we subscribe to the same magazine, it's the exact same magazine except for our address. And the New Yorker is like a dense magazine. Like it has like these very long articles, but it also has cartoons. And it's kind of like you asking, like, oh, do we read the same things? Do we skip the same parts? Do we? And I thought the sort of universality, is that a word? Universality of it was
Yeah.
like, seeing somebody who's so like maybe different from you, because I think you also talk about you live in California and this person lives in New York or something like that, right? Or it's
Right,
like you
right.
guys were living in two different environments, or you were describing two different things, and but you have this like universal interest, but like there's so many different ways to read a magazine, or if you apply it to other things, like people maybe have the same sort of something in common, but maybe have two different perspectives on it, and it's like you're curious about this partner, you're like, oh, like, are you doing the same thing as me? Like maybe there's like a little bit of mystery there, a little bit of like, I don't know, lust or feeling of love, or like I don't know. Is that, am I interpreting it correctly?
Oh, well, first thing, the interpretation of poetry is always the reader's interpretation is the correct interpretation, and every reader will have a different interpretation, and that is okay. I think poetry is intended to be more open-ended and open to the individual interpretation. I wrote a poem called Tethered, which is turned into an animated short film by a wonderful hand-drawn animation artist and director in Milan, Italy. So that poem it was inspired by a bell buoy in the San Francisco Bay, and there are these, these buoys that when they move around, the bells clang, and they're intended to, warn ships of not getting too close to shore. So they're really important, but they're tethered to the ocean, fixed in place, totally isolated. They see the seasons go by, they see the ships go by, and this bell, I imagine this bell buoy having all, having sharks swim by and seagulls perch on it, and it's seeing the ships and seeing the seasons change, and then wishing it was dreaming of being untethered and being sea glass on the shore, being to be picked up by someone and no longer being alone. So that idea has been interpreted so many different ways. The Milan artist who I worked with in 2021, so still pandemic times, it reminded her of her grandparents who passed away from COVID, and she was never able to visit them because of the lockdown in Italy. It reminded a good friend of mine in Toronto, where I used to live in Canada. It reminded her of her elderly parents who still live independently. They're in their 90s and they see the world around them, but they aren't fit enough to get out and drive cars. So they are tethered to their home, but they see the world evolving around them. So I've heard totally different interpretations from people who've read my poems. So I rarely I'll talk about what inspired me to write the poem, but I won't get into meaning because I think the meaning is what the reader interprets it to mean.
Yeah, absolutely. That reminds me of your poem about San Francisco. I forgot what it's called. Is it called just
Yeah,
San Francisco? Yeah,
she is San Francisco. Yeah.
I loved that one because my parents loved San Francisco. Like we're from Buffalo. We live in Buffalo, but for some reason my parents love San Francisco. So I went to San Francisco like 4 or 5 times when I was a kid because my parents just love visiting. And one of my favorite memories is just walking around the city with my parents, and the way that you like paint the picture of the Golden Gate Bridge or like the fog coming in is just so beautiful. And it reminded me of being there as a little kid with my parents. And like, I remember we biked over the bridge to Sausalito, and yeah. So, and like my dad passed away last year. And so, but those are some of like my happiest like family memories are just being in San Francisco and going to like the restaurants, or like they would take us to Chinatown because there's not really a lot of Chinese. For the listeners, I'm Chinese in case they didn't know. But there's not a lot of Chinese people in Buffalo. So we'd go to Chinatown, San Francisco. And so that's a poem that I really connected to because it reminded me of my family, And so the point is, like I'm sure you were definitely not thinking of my family when you were writing that
Right,
poem.
of
But of
course.
course, like
Yeah.
when reading that poem, like I brought my own experience. And there's probably a million other people who read that poem who like have a million other different interpretations of it or bringing their experience to it. So yeah, I love that.
Yeah, no, that's a poem that really resonates with audience, and that's one I took the time to memorize, which I've done with some of the poems that I've written, so that I can pull it out of my back pocket whenever I get the chance. And it's short; it's like a 50-second poem, but boy, does it resonate with people. And I tried really hard to capture the essence of San Francisco in 50 seconds, with lots of little Easter eggs that will pull on different threads and things that start with things that affect me and that I find why I love the city so much. Yeah, I live about 45 minutes outside of San Francisco, but I'm in there probably once a week. My younger daughter lives in the heart of the city,
Oh,
so it's
awesome.
yeah, it's an amazing place.
Yeah, would you mind reciting it if that's okay? So
Sure,
the
I will
listeners can
absolutely do
hear?
that.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's from the book, my book, The Plague Doctor. And let me just put it up. Oh, here we go. So there's the poem. You can see it's pretty short, and there's a picture I took of the Golden Gate Bridge in the fog. She is San Francisco in shades of pink and blue, a painted lady with combat boots and attitude. She wears sweatshirts in summer, chilled by salt-soaked fog spilling over evening tides. You might catch a glimpse of her rollerblading across the Golden Gate as you sail beneath suspended steel into Pacific swells. She is portraits in De Young, a cable car's clang, a skate punk sprayed in neon green who runs from bay to breakers or swirls around a rainbow flag on Market Street in June. She is San Francisco, spun with threads of sunset hues and wisps of endless dune. I love reading that poem.
I love it so much. You do such a fantastic job of just like painting the different scenes and all the different like cool characters you can find like in the city. And yeah, so that one is amazing. I love that one. I'm curious, whenever you have an idea for a poem, like where does a poem start for you, if that makes sense? Like, does it start with an image maybe, or a phrase or a word or a feeling? Like, does that question make sense?
Yeah,
Okay.
oh, it absolutely
Okay.
makes sense. So the poem "Tethered" is an example of that, and I encourage people to go check it out. You can Google "Tethered" James Morehead, and you'll see the film is out there. But that was when I saw I was walking with my wife north of the Golden Gate Bridge up in Marin, and I saw the bell buoy, and I started to have this idea of what it would be like to be that bell buoy, and I just told my wife, hold on a second, I jot down on my phone "Tethered bell buoy," and that's all I wrote down. But tethered was right from the beginning. I thought that's the title of the poem, and now I'll build around it. In the case of She is San Francisco, since I just read it, I was seeing the poet Billy Collins, who is the former poet laureate of the U.S. Wonderful poet who's very accessible. So I was going to see him doing a reading and a Q&A, and while before I got to the venue in near Civic Center right downtown, and this is kind of a little after the pandemic, the height of the pandemic, when San Francisco, like a lot of cities, went through a really rough ride. And but I was walking around the city and I felt it just coming back to life. And then I was sitting in the audience and I just started writing "She is San Francisco," and that's where the title came to me. And then I went, which isn't usually the case. Usually titles are a nightmare. And then I started writing it, and then I had the concept, and then I had to just flesh it out. But then there are other poems where they can be inspired by the most random things. There's a friend of mine who did the cover art of Canvas. So she does these elaborate Halloween costumes. She posted one on Instagram, and that inspired the title poem, "The Plague Doctor," which has nothing to do with the pandemic. And then I kind of used this photograph of her as a pivot. And then maybe one more example is this museum project I'm working on. I saw a piece of art in the De Young Museum, and no, sorry, at the Legion of Honor Museum, and it was this trompe l'oeil, which is a painting that looks three-dimensional. And it was a trompe l'oeil. It was huge, and it had these game birds hanging from hooks in this kind of Renaissance style. And there was fruit, and there was baskets of wine, and then some other, I think, a hare and a pheasant on the ground. And I looked at this beautiful painting and I went, that's interesting. Everything in here is dead, but there's no blood.
Ooh.
And so I had the thought of that's what I'll zoom in on, and I'll call the poem "Beautiful Dead Things," which is going to be the title of the book.
Oh,
And
cool.
so that was the hook. And maybe one more example, just to because you got me in a roll here. One more. I was at the Oakland Museum of California. There was this beautifully ornate picture of a woman from the Gold Rush era, and but the frame was amazing. And so I decided, but the portrait artist, you always have their signature, but you don't know who made the frame. So this hand carved frame. So I made the poem about the frame, rather than the act. I did talk about the portrait, but mainly made it about the frame and where it would have come from and the wood that would have been used and stuff like that.
Oh, cool. That's cool that you have like different interpretations of the art, but also like your real life and like real moments that have happened when you write about them. When you are writing about moments that are inspired by your life, and you're writing about, as you said earlier, sort of like more everyday things or things that maybe seem mundane on the surface, but you can kind of expand upon. Like, how do you know when, I guess, a moment is air quotes like worth writing about, if that makes sense?
I try not to think too hard about that at the start of writing. I think again, the way I used to write was to wait for this idea that I knew was really great before I'd start writing it, and then you end up not writing very much. Now I just start writing, and then if it doesn't work, it doesn't work, or a piece of it may work. And I've had poems where I took a piece that was working and another piece that was working, and then together they worked, and I tossed the rest. So I don't really worry about, I try not to worry about that, about whether anything is going to turn into something interesting until in the editing and revision process. And then I have a writing group I attend virtually every Sunday, which is amazing. I also have a poetry coach who I pay once every month and a half or 2 months, and I'll bring several poems. And he's a screenwriter as well as an amazing writer and poet and an educator. And, uh, and he gives me really just biting and insightful and helpful feedback that make just elevates the poems, not with telling me what to write, but asking questions and pointing out things. So yeah, I think the best way to write is just to write. Worry about revision and editing later. Don't worry about the form or what type of poem it is. Some poets will decide I want to write a sonnet and they'll write a sonnet. I usually write something and then figure out what I take this raw material and mold it into.
Gotcha, gotcha. Do you have favorite literary techniques that you use in your poems?
Well, I didn't do an MFA, so that is one thing I used to feel very self-conscious about, that I didn't get a master's in fine arts and poetry, that I have an engineering degree. Although I have now, I think I read a lot of poetry and I will see things that are challenging or different or interesting. So an example of that would be there's this poetic form called a sestina that I'd never heard of, and then I was watching a poetry films for what my first poetry film Tethered was in this festival, and I was watching the other films in the festival, and there was this beautiful poetry film about Lady Macbeth, and I tracked down the poem, and then it was a sestina, and I ended up reaching out and connecting with the poet, who's a wonderful person, and I looked into this form, the sestina, and I thought I have to write one of these someday. And the sestina is a form of poetry where you choose 6 words, and then it's a 7 stanza poem. The first 6 stanzas all have 6 lines, and the end words or the last words in each line are one of the 6 words you chose, but the order is very specific and different in each stanza. And then the seventh stanza, called the envoy, has these 6 words in pairs in a specific order. So the way the last line, the last word in each line, and then the way the last 3 lines works, it's very rigidly defined. So the words you choose and making it work without it feeling forced or obvious is just a real challenge. So I ended up writing a poem that's my latest poetry film called Welcome to the Tenderloin, and it uses this form, and when people hear the poem or read it, they don't even notice that there are 6 words repeated 7 times, which is my goal, is to hide all of that. And then the complexity of that form worked really well for the subject matter. So yeah, so that was one example of that.
That's awesome. Do you ever experience writer's block or get into ruts where you feel uninspired?
Oh, absolutely. Oh my goodness. Yeah. So one of the good examples of that is let me see if I can find it here. There's actually 2 examples from my latest book, but I'll zoom in on one where I knew I was getting stuck, and that I needed to do something to get me inspired. And so I decided I love ghost towns. And so I decided I'm going to just go visit a ghost town one Sunday. And of course, when I'm looking for a poem in my book, I can never find them, but I will shortly. 'cause there's some cool photos of it that'll bring it to life. So I researched some ghost towns that were a decent drive from where we live, and I ended up going to a place called Bodie, California. And Bodie, California is a 6.5 hour drive from my house. So I asked my family, "Do you want to come with me on a 6.5 hour drive from where we live?" And it's a round trip, 6.5 hours each way. And they're like,
Wow.
"No, no." So I got up really early and drove to Bodie, California, and it's a ghost town that's been perfectly preserved the interiors have been perfectly preserved. So people filtered away from this gold rush town that was in the 10,000 people. It was a huge place. Now there's nobody that lives there, and as people left, they left their stuff behind. And as they left their stuff behind, it was the only thing the park has done, and I think it's a state park or national park. The only thing they've done is they have preserved the roofs so that the interior of the interiors don't totally decay. And so there's the poem, and there's a couple photographs that I took.
Wow. That's so
And
cool.
so looking inside this hotel, that was exactly what it looked like. It's not staged. It's not like one of these museum sets where it's period pieces, but they've been chosen. No, that's what it was
Wow.
when people left. So you'll look inside and see wallpaper falling off the walls, and so it was perfect inspiration. So as I was driving back, as I had a long drive, I was thinking the ghosts of Bodie, California, and then had all this amazing imagery and this element of my family not wanting to go with me and do this long drive. Although I twisted that a little bit to make it a little more ambiguous. So yeah, so I think the best thing to do when you get writer's block is to change your location. It could be as much as just go for a walk in your neighborhood, but go down a street you haven't gone down before, and that can be enough to give you something to write about. And also, when you're out in the world, don't be glued to your phone. Be looking around you, and you will see lots of inspiration if you lift your head up and open your eyes and listen and just sort of, be present and absorb everything around you. I mean, because poetry can zoom in on a flower that's set in a certain way that really inspires you. It could be the way a family interacts. It could be anything. It can be very small moments, but it's you have to have your eyes off your phone to see them.
Yeah, that's fantastic advice. Someone in a different episode, we were talking about ways to get out of like any sort of rut or creative block. And the advice that I love, that I'm really bad at, so I need to take my own advice, is I go on walks, but without headphones. Because I think now, like, everybody puts on headphones for their walks. And I do that sometimes. Like, sometimes it's fun to listen to music or a podcast as I walk my dogs. But if you take your headphones off, like, it'll be like really, if you're not used to it, like maybe like boring or like, I don't know, feel weird at first. But walking with your headphones off, especially if you live in a place like San Francisco or New York City where there are characters everywhere, there's always
Yes.
something crazy happening, both good and bad. You'll find something, you'll hear something, you'll see something that you wouldn't have heard if you were focused on the music you were listening to or the podcast you were listening to.
I definitely have an idea I haven't done this yet, but work takes me to New York a couple times a year, and if I have a trip where I can include a weekend in it, I would take the subway with my headphones off and just listen for phrases of things from conversations. I remember there was one, and the gist of it was the only part I heard was, "And that's where we left the horse." And that was all I heard. And I think there is actually a website called Overheard in New York or something like
Yeah.
that, where it's
Mhm.
these, yeah, where it's just so take these little found snippets of things people said, and then find a poem in them as a fun little project.
I love that. I love that. That would be such a fun project. Yeah, just like kind of an overheard sort of
Yes.
inspired series. I love that. um, when you think, or do you think about the ways in which your poems are going to be consumed as you're writing them? So, for example, if you're writing a poem that you know is meant to be read versus a poem that you're going to perform, so it's meant to be listened to, or maybe a poem that you want to turn into a short film, which you've done with a few of your pieces. Like, does the medium of how people consume your poetry like affect you when you're writing it? the poems?
I think not so much when I write it, but I definitely have poems that are better read on paper than read recited out loud. So here's an example of this poem,
Oh,
which is
cool.
kind of a concrete poem called Wade. And then the cover artist for this book also let me use a bunch of her this black powder artwork that she does. So the so this one I have actually read this poem when I do high school visits, and because I ask the students, "What do you think this looks like?" And there's no wrong answers. I'm just curious, right? So a poem like that is it's hard to recite. There are other poems like "She is San Francisco" and "Crush" that, as I'm writing them, I knew these are gonna be poems that I read out loud a lot, and that I will take the time to memorize them because they just they're poems that just work so well recited, and not seeing it on the page is you're not losing a ton because of that. Although I'd say poetry is another cool art form because the poems have multiple lives. They have the life on the page, and I do recommend if you're going to read poetry, read it in a physical book. It's challenging to reproduce poetry effectively in ebooks because ebooks need to adjust to the size of the reader, and that can mess up the line breaks. And the line breaks, poets agonize over line breaks. So you want to end spacing. So you want to see that truthful in its true form. But anyways, there's the life of the poem on the page. There may be a life of the poem visualized on social media, and I think poetry on social media is fantastic. Certain types of poems work really well in that more Instagram bite size. Although people do put pretty long poems with multiple images, there's the life of the poem when you recite it. There's the life of the poem when you only hear it recited. There's the life of the poem when you see it performed by the poet, particularly slam poetry and spoken word. And then there's the life of the poem when someone else recites it and they will interpret it and emphasize things in a totally different way. So I think there are more lives to a poem than there are lives to a novel because a novel is necessarily more constrained to a structure then and also you can't. It's not like someone could come up and just start recite all of War and Peace. It's a different animal.
Yeah.
You as an individual will spend hours and hours with a novel. Like I'm just now listening to the audiobook on my long commutes of East of Eden, and that's a 25-hour audiobook. You're not gonna recite that. Whereas a poem, you can gather people and say, can you give me 90 seconds? And then poof, they can walk away moved.
I love that. How do you know when a poem is done?
Yeah, so I think that the certainly having these formal steps where I involve other people, and I think it's very important that you involve other people in the editing process and the revision process, and to get critique and feedback. And I use this writing group meet with every Sunday, and we have an online, in addition to the real time, we have an online place where we're able to give each other feedback. This poetry coach I talk about, he's not formally, his formal title isn't poetry coach, but that's what I call him because it best describes it. I do also use things like Gemini as a sort of a first pass critique. So I'll use a chatbot just to give me a sense of how it's going, and I find that helpful. Like it's not anywhere like my poetry coach or the writing group because it doesn't have the same personal experience, but it can be helpful in catching inconsistencies or things that don't make sense, or asking questions depending on how you prompt it. So I find that that's a useful tool too. And however, it's at the end of the day, none of those feedback mechanisms will tell you when a poem is done. That's something that you just kind of have to feel in your gut, that if you keep working the dough, there's a point where the dough is not going to get better. And I have had poems where I've gone back. Like actually, let me see in my second book, Portraits of Red and Gray, the very last poem in the book, Lost and Found, which I really love. It's a 5 stanza poem. If I recite it now, I cut the last stanza completely. And it's better. It was good before, and I don't think it was bad before, but having let it settle for over a couple of years, I go, yeah, it's a much stronger poem if I cut the last stanza entirely. So I occasionally I will make adjustments like that even many years later. But for the most part, I will reach a point where, yep, you know what? It's law of diminishing returns at a certain point. You're just it might get a little better, but there is a big risk it's going to get worse.
Gotcha, gotcha. That makes sense. That it's like an intuition based thing for sure. Um, so you are the Poet Laureate Emeritus, those are hard words to say, of
Yes, tongue
Dublin,
twister.
yeah, of Dublin, California. What does that title mean exactly?
So, Poet Laureate Emeritus, the Emeritus is something I get to have for life now. So, I am no longer the Poet Laureate. I did it for 4 years, two-year terms. And this is a position that many cities, not all, but many cities have, and our country and state does in California, and many states have. And the role of a poet laureate is to bring literary arts into the community. In the national and state positions, it's there's a stipend and you're getting paid to some degree. And at the city level, typically it's a volunteer position, but it's one that the city goes through a process, a competitive process to choose. And so both times I competed against other local poets, and thankfully there's a one of the poets I competed against is now the poet laureate after I chose to not go for a third term. And some of the things I've done or I did as poet laureate for the 4 years I did it was I would organize a poetry walk every April for National Poetry Month, and that would be I'd find through an open call for poetry 25 poets, and then I would, working with the city, identify 25 local businesses, and then I would design poetry posters, one for each poem, and then put them in the storefronts for the whole month of April, and then create a kind of a passport or a guide to where all the locations. So then these small businesses, who I did this 4 years in a row, they got very excited because then they would see they would want to be part of the poetry walk. So that their small business got a bit of a got some foot traffic and a boost, and then these poets get their poems stumbled on. And a poem is, again, you can take 90, 60, 90 seconds and read a poem. It's not much of a, you don't have to, it's not much to ask. So I did that. I was asked by the city to write original poems for several different things. There was the classic opening of a new park. And so we have a pretty diverse community, particularly in Asian, East Asian, and South Asian community here. And so I wanted to, in opening that park, I really wanted it to capture the collage of people in the community. So I snuck in little references to cricket as an example. And this father came up to me afterwards, this Indian father, and he said his son perked up as soon as he heard the word cricket in the poem, and he was affected by it because he felt seen. So that was exactly what I was trying to do. I was asked to do captions for 6 statues in the Heritage Park and Museums about the history of Dublin, and those captions I wrote as a prose poem in 6 stanzas, and then they're stamped into metal, which is extremely cool. So that's going to be around a long, long time. And then I did an open mic, poetry and pizza, for multiple years, which gave an opportunity for poets in a low stakes environment to recite their poems out loud, which is really important. So yeah, I felt that it was a very satisfying, but it was busy on top of my day job. So after 4 years, I was ready for someone else to take the mantle. But that's effective. It's a it depend. You make of it what you make of it what you have the time to make of it. And the city of Dublin was fantastic. They trusted me, and um, I never made them regret that. So they gave me a lot of freedom to bring literary arts in the community. And I did also high school speaking is another thing I did too.
That's so cool. You did so many cool projects and activities and events. That sounds like an awesome role to have. Like, what did being chosen as poet laureate mean to you? Because I assume, is it like kind of your first like official like poetry job in a sense? You know what I mean?
Right.
Like what did that mean to you?
It was kind of it was the last little nudge that got me past the imposter syndrome, where my parents are both professional musicians, so there was all part of me that wanted to consider myself an artist, even though I'm a computer engineer working in Silicon Valley as a product manager. I mean, I had it stuck in my head that, well, because I have that, I can't be this other thing too. And when I spoke to student groups and as a poet laureate emeritus, it really the focus was the poet side, but then one teacher mentioned I was also this tech industry person, and then it really lit up students because they're like, "Oh, you can be both." It's like, yes, I didn't always realize that, but yes, you can be both and be open about both. So it worked. People are totally, they think it's really cool that I have this poetry side of me. And you can absolutely, you don't have to choose one or the other. It takes a lot of juggling, it's a lot of time management. I will be able to lean in to poetry differently than someone, say Dana Joya, who I had a chance to interview for a poetry podcast I do. He's the former poet laureate of California, and he was also I think a VP of marketing at a large consumer brand, and so he had to do that juggle for many, many years until later in life he actually made literary side his full-time job, which is pretty rare. But there's a lot of poets and writers and artists of all kind who necessarily have two lives, and it just took me a while to learn. And certainly the poet laureate title basically forced me to not shy away from being a poet. It was really helpful for that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so cool that you can inspire people that they can be multifaceted, especially at such an impressionable age. Like I feel like in high school you're trying to pick a lane, trying to figure out who you are. So I it's so cool that you set such a great example for those kids that yeah, you can like be, a science, more engineering, like math-based person, but also like a very artistic person as well. You don't have to pick one or the other or silo yourself. That's really cool.
Yeah, totally. And I think this whole right brain, left brain, I'm a creative person, I'm not, I think it's nonsense. I think it's also been pretty much debunked that that's not really true. I think that there's creative elements to so many different jobs, and that creativity is not constrained to just one type of person, and that it's also, the right brain, left brain sort of is a fixed mindset type of thing where anyone can be creative for things they're passionate about, and the form of that creativity may take many, many different forms. Like people who I remember, I talked to someone in a parking lot about this incredible truck that they had, just elaborate lighting and undercoat lighting, and and then he was really passionate about it and talked about all the design choices. And this is a very creative person, right? I don't know if he considered himself that, but what he created was this amazing vehicle. And it's like that. So creativity can take many forms, and it shouldn't be just confined to people with a certain degree or a certain skill set. So that, I think creativity is inherent in humanity, and it's just a thing that we all have, and it comes out in different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned right at the beginning of this interview that poetry is kind of having a renaissance. And it sounds like working with these students, you're inspiring them. Could you talk about some of the things that you've seen sort of like, I guess, coming up in the poetry scene?
I think one thing about running an open mic for in Dublin, California, which is, it's far enough removed from the large cities around here, Oakland, San Francisco, and San Jose are a good 30 to 45 minutes away. And Dublin is a town of 70,000. So it's not small, but it's not huge. But at the open mic, where we have 25 to as many as 50 people sometimes, on any given open mic, especially near the beginning, when we were untapping a need that hadn't been tapped into. There was no open mic in Dublin before the one that I started at this on the patio of this pizza place. The Pretty consistently 50% of the people performing would had never performed their poetry in front of a live audience ever, or even shared it with anyone, right?
Wow, that's pretty
Uh,
incredible.
it's pretty incredible. It really
Yeah.
stuck in my mind. And then I remember the one of the early ones, there was a poet who was 80, there was a poet who was 10, and everything in between. So it really, and there were two English teachers there who were really moved, because I think teachers can get frustrated and jaded by the current situation and status of funding of the arts, and it really gave them this hope that yeah, there's lots of people doing artistic things that are flying under the radar. So I think poetry is like that. I think there's a lot of incredible poets who share their poetry online through things like Instagram or through YouTube videos, and it gives them a way to find an audience that might be fairly narrow or unique, So I think that I think that poetry is doing really well. I mean, I think that you can't think of it in the same way as more industrial things, and you can't think of it in more of in terms of the money it's generating. But I think in terms of the amount of quality art that's being generated, it's doing really well. And I think particularly a ton of terrific women poets are really flourishing. And if I go back like 100, 120, 150 years ago, it was kind of men that dominated poetry, and women writing poetry had to do so with pseudonyms or hiding behind men, which was very unfortunate. So now it's totally flipped. And I think women rule when it comes to poetry right now.
That's fantastic. That's so cool. Do you think that, or how has, serving in the role as poet laureate and like, as in like a very public way, like promoting and bringing poetry to your community, how has it sort of unlocked different parts of the community that maybe you wouldn't have met or experienced otherwise?
Oh, sure. I ended up meeting certainly a lot of people and learning about them through their poetry, and open mics are an interesting. There's an open mic I go to in San Francisco periodically, a terrific open mic by this nonprofit, Decentered Arts, to give them a shout out. They do an open mic every single week, and either at that open mic or other open mics I've been to, you kind of get to peer into people's lives and souls. A lot of open mic poetry can be very raw and confessional. Again, it's a low stakes environment. You might be seeing someone who's going through something really challenging or difficult, and you get an essence of that. And you take a step back and you go, okay, that's a poem that needs work, or maybe it's not really a poem that will survive an edit, but it's an amazing expression of what they're feeling in that moment. And so through that, yeah, I met some really amazing people, made lots of new friends, and also open mics are, there's no heckling or tomato throwing at a poetry open mic. People are really supportive. Also, the form of it is, you get up there for 3 minutes. I mean, if it's a really lousy 3 minutes, it's only 3 minutes. You can kind of wait 3 minutes and move on to the next one, and then maybe there's a gem. So I think also poetry, because you can do so much in a short amount of time, that there's not the same pressure to come up with 30 minutes of brilliance at an open mic. You can have 3 minutes and experiment and feel totally free doing so.
I love that. I love that. Do you approach writing poetry differently when it's writing for the city, for example, versus for your like about your own or for your own personal work?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, when I was writing things for the city of Dublin, and thankfully, like I said, they were really supportive and didn't try to be my editor, which would have been. I've talked to other poets laureate, and the city has tried to be a poetry editor, which is not what their expertise is. So no, City of Dublin was terrific, and yeah, I did. There was a couple more examples. So I wrote a poem for the anniversary of Dublin, 25th anniversary, and in doing so, um, I really wanted to be respectful of the history and the history before, because Dublin has obviously only been here a short amount of time, and I wanted to respect the history before that and weave that together, which is challenging to do. I've also did a couple of poems for Veterans Days events. In those cases, I had actually written poems that were relevant separately, and then they ended up being perfect for those events. And so I'm very conscious of not abusing the trust the city has given in me. So that is a constraint, but constraints are good in poetry. Just like the sestina I talked about before has this very rigid structure, and that constraint you have to pour the poetry into. So with the city of Dublin, the constraint might be I did a poem for this walking bridge that's part of the Iron Horse Trail, and I'm like, what the heck am I going to do? But then I looked into the history and found, oh, this walking bridge that's the tail end of this Iron Horse Trail. The Iron Horse Trail was the site of a railroad, and that railroad was a connector railroad that connected to the Transcontinental Railroad. And so then I was able to make the poem as much about the history of this trail, and then this beautiful arching walking bridge and the role that it plays. So it was so yeah, I thought that was going to be a really tough one that was constraining, and in fact, it unlocked all these interesting historical elements that made the poem a poem.
Oh, that's so cool. That's awesome. What are some lessons that you've learned through poetry?
Lessons that I have learned. I think one of the big lessons and an area where I really had to grow was the performance of poetry and unlike my professional life where I've done lots of presentations to executives and all these things, that the performing for an audience, which my parents know as professional musicians, is just a different animal. But that learning how to perform my poetry has also helped me in a professional context where I know some of that performance ability is infused in the way I tell a story at work. Because in a way, in a business context, you're always telling stories too. And so I think that's one of the things one of the biggest things that I've personally grown from is, and I've gotten coaching on how to, from a couple of different people on how to perform my poetry. And that has definitely made me more conscious of the way in which I present myself in front of an audience.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. There's definitely like, yeah, some life lessons of, yeah, just being able to speak. And I'm sure it's probably in your day job made you maybe a more creative thinker or maybe a better writer than somebody else. Just in ways that you do tell the stories in your day to day. I assume. I don't know. You tell me.
Totally. No, it's like I mean, the editing. I think the other thing that poetry makes you comfortable with is feedback because
Mm.
you can write good poems in isolation, and even many great ones. Emily Dickinson, I think she wrote all her, I don't know if she had much feedback on her poetry, but she created just an amazing storehouse. So there's exceptions to creating great poetry without an editor, but most great poems have had critical feedback in some form or another. And so I think that writing a poetry and seeing a poem go from good to great as it goes through an editorial process with feedback from people who really know poetry and just listeners and friends and family makes you more open to feedback because you know that, yeah, the feedback you get in the middle might be, oh, I got to do a bunch of work to fix this thing that's been identified. And I know they're right, but it's more work and I want to be done. You get to see many examples of how something got so much better. And so then you start to not just accept feedback, but seek it out. And in a work context too, I actively try to seek feedback on things I'm working on because I know whatever I'm working on will get better as it survives the pressure of critical feedback. And if when pressure is applied to an idea, it either gets stronger or it collapses, and then you have to rebuild. And that's okay. It's better to find that out early. And if it survives the pressure, then it will get stronger.
Yeah, absolutely. What advice would you give someone who is maybe interested in starting to write poetry or just starting to get into poetry, but maybe they feel intimidated or they're worried that they're going to write a bad poem or something like that? What advice would you give that person?
So the best advice I give is just start writing and don't worry about it being bad or good because who the heck knows? You're not going to know for a while. So, or, and then read poems out loud to family members just to get a sense of what it sounds. The voice you hear in your head and the voice you hear when you're talking are different somehow. It's just weird. And then also read. The best writers are readers because then you may discover a form of poetry and go, oh, I'd like to try that, like with this Sestina, where I became aware of this form and saw a great example and thought, oh, I want to try that. So go to a library or go to a bookstore and go to the poetry section. And poems are short, so just pick a book randomly, read the first poem. It'll take you 60 to 90 seconds, and if it affects you, then read the second poem. And if you get through two or three and you really like it, well, buy that book. And then use that as like a starting point of how you might write something yourself. But I think the best way to write is to just start writing, and the best way to learn how to write without formal education is to read a lot of books, read a lot of poetry, read other types of creative writing. And then if you're fortunate enough to have a writing group in your community, join a writing group. That can be really helpful too.
Yeah, absolutely. Community is so important. Like surrounding yourself with people who encourage you is so important for sure. This has been wonderful, James. Thank you so much. Are you ready to move into the lightning round?
Let's go.
All right. What is something new that you've tried lately?
New that I've tried lately is writing a duplex, which is a more modern form of poetry, and it's a poem that'll be in my next books. It was inspired by a wonderful museum in San Francisco. So I've got a poem that I'm working on inspired by that form of the duplex.
Cool. Well, we're excited to read it whenever it comes out. Do you have a lesson or a message that you want to share with listeners?
Yeah, if you have this creative endeavor that you do separate from a totally unrelated day job, treat it as an equal partner. I used to be product manager in the tech industry. I also write poetry, but I don't tell anybody. Now I'm a product manager in the tech industry. I'm a poet. They are equal levels. And so put it at an equal level in your mind. And when you do that, you'll feel a lot better about the creative side.
Wow, that is fantastic advice. I've never heard that before, but wow, my mind is blown. I love that. What is one thing you wish you knew when you were first starting out?
I wish I knew that if I wrote every day, you would write a lot more great stuff. And I wish I'd established that habit a lot earlier. But the other thing is, I was worried at one point that I would be as I got older, I would have missed the window to be a great poet. And that is total nonsense. The older you get, the better poet you are because you have a longer timeline or lifeline of experiences to draw from. So aging does not make you a worse poet. And Margaret Atwood said I remember in an interview, she said she didn't like her earlier poetry as much because she didn't have as much life experience. So don't worry about having missed some magic window.
I love that because I am 29 and there's all these things that are like, oh, once you turn 30, you can't do this, you can't do that or whatever. And I'm like, I feel like my life's just getting started. Like
Totally.
that, like, what is this nonsense? Like, who cares that it's never too late to try something new? Like, who gives a fuck? So, yeah, I love
Totally.
that.
Yeah.
I love that because, yeah, I think it's such a toxic mindset to be like, once you turn 30, you can't, whatever,
There are
or like
some
whatever it is.
incredible there are some incredible poets and writers who only really started writing 40 or 50 and had all their success 40 or 50 and above. So yes, it's complete nonsense that there's some sort of expiry date on creativity. It's just not true.
I love that. Yes, for sure. All right, James, this has been so wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your work, for reading a poem and diving into all of your writing processes and your poetry work because it's so cool and so inspiring. Where can everybody find you, read your work, support you, check you out, all the things?
Sure. So the easiest way to find me is to just Google my name. So James Morehead, one O in Morehead. If you Google me, you will find me. You can also go to my website, Viewless Wings, Viewless Wings, Wings, viewlesswings.com. That is a little piece of a line from a poem by Keats, The Viewless Wings of Poesy, which I read back in that 10th grade class. And when I was looking for a website domain, miraculously that was available. But the easiest way to find me is just to Google me, and then yeah, my books are available in all the usual places. And on my website, you'll see the poetry films I've created and lots of other content. And then there's a poetry podcast that I host on a periodic basis where I've interviewed 70 plus poets now, and I've learned a ton from them talking about their poetry, their books, their craft, and it's just a great resource for somebody who wants an MFA through a podcast.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, James.
Thank you so much for inviting me and talking about poetry. It's wonderful.